The contract lay on the polished walnut table like a quiet threat. Its pages heavy, not because of the paper, but because of the numbers printed at the bottom. 7 figures, clean and precise. A sum that could erase mistakes, silence doubt, and rewrite futures. The boardroom was too bright for the hour, sunlight slicing through the glass walls and casting long reflections across the faces of men who were used to power, used to winning and used to watching others bend. At the far end of the table, Dean Martin sat with his hands folded loosely in front of him. Posture relaxed, expression unreadable, a faint smile resting at the corner of his mouth, not the smile of arrogance, but the calm of a man who had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than protests. They had called this meeting routine. The word alone should have raised alarms. Nothing involving this much money was ever routine. The studio executives spoke in practiced tones, praising his legacy, his reliability, his box office pull, their words flowing like oil over water. They talked about revivals, anniversaries, international markets, and how the world was ready for him again, in a bigger way than ever before. Dean listened politely, nodding when courtesy required it, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the city skyline beyond the glass, where real people hurried through real lives, unaware of the quiet calculations happening above them. Then the tone shifted. It always did. One executive, young, sharp-suited, confident in the way only people protected by money could be, slid the final page forward with 2 fingers. His voice lowered, as if sharing a secret rather than issuing a demand. "There's just one condition," he said, smiling as though that word were harmless. Dean didn't reach for the paper. He didn't lean forward. He simply waited. The condition wasn't written in ink. It never was. It was spoken, carefully framed, wrapped in language meant to sound reasonable, even progressive. It involved distancing himself from someone, an old collaborator, friend from the early days, a man the industry now considered inconvenient. The executive didn't use cruel words. He didn't need to. He spoke of optics, of public comfort, of market sensitivity. He spoke as though human loyalty were a liability to be managed. For a moment, the room held its breath. Dean looked down at the table, then up at the men watching him. The smile on his face didn't disappear, but something firmer settled behind it. A memory surfaced, uninvited but powerful. Smoky back rooms, shared laughter after long nights, standing shoulder to shoulder when neither of them had power or protection. Back when respect was earned, not negotiated. He pushed his chair back slightly. The sound was small, but it landed like a gavel. "No," he said, just one word. No anger, no theatrics, no explanation. The executives exchanged glances, surprised more by the speed of his response than by the refusal itself. They had expected resistance, perhaps negotiation. They had expected him to ask how much more. They had expected, eventually, compliance. One of them laughed lightly, assuming it was a joke. "Dean, let's not be hasty. This is $1 million deal." Dean's eyes met his, steady and clear. "Then you should be careful what you ask in exchange for it." Silence spread across the room, thick and uncomfortable. Someone cleared their throat. Another tried to pivot, reminding him of what this money could secure future projects. Security for generations, a permanent seat at the table. They spoke as though he didn't already understand the value of wealth, so he hadn't lived long enough to know its limits. Dean stood. Not abruptly, not angrily. He gathered his coat with the same calm he'd shown when he arrived. "I've turned down more money than this before," he said quietly, "but I've never turned down my name. And I won't start today." As he walked toward the door, no one stopped him. Power, after all, was only loud when it believed itself unchallenged. The door closed softly behind him, sealing the room in stunned quiet. Outside, the hallway felt cooler, quieter, more honest. Dean paused, breathing in, as though shaking off a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. He didn't know what this decision would cost him. He only knew what it would save. News of the refusal didn't break immediately. Deals like this rarely did, but whispers moved fast in the industry, faster than contracts, faster than truth. Some called him difficult. Others called him outdated. A few, quietly, called him brave. Dean ignored all of it. He spent the evening somewhere far from glass towers and polished tables. Sitting in a small club where the lights were warm and the music didn't pretend to be anything. It wasn't a young singer took the stage, nervous hands gripping the microphone. She reminded Dean of himself decades earlier, hopeful, unsure, standing on the edge of something fragile. When she finished, the room applauded politely. Dean stood and clapped until his palms stung. The singer looked at him, surprised, then smiled in a way that told him she felt seen. That was the thing about integrity. It rarely paid immediately. It didn't come with bonuses or headlines. But it had a way of echoing, of showing up in places money never could. The next morning, Dean's phone rang before sunrise. He let it ring twice before answering. "Dean," a familiar voice said, strained. "We need to talk." He looked out the window as the city slowly woke, lights spilling across rooftops. Somewhere, deals were being made. Conditions were being set. Lines were being crossed. Dean smiled faintly. "Then talk," he said. And as the conversation unfolded, it became clear that the $1 million deal he'd refused was only the beginning of something far larger, something that would test not just his career, but the industry's understanding of loyalty, courage, and what it truly meant to stand for something when the cost was real. The consequences did not arrive loudly. They never did. They slipped in quietly, disguised as delays, unanswered calls, meetings that were suddenly postponed indefinitely. Dean noticed it first in the silences, the spaces where opportunity used to speak. His phone, once alive with invitations and check-ins, now sat heavy and still on the table beside his coffee. It wasn't fear he felt as he watched it. It was recognition. He had seen this before, years ago, when others had refused to play the game the way it was written for them. This was how the industry punished dignity without leaving fingerprints. By midweek, the whispers grew sharper. A producer he'd known for decades avoided eye contact at a charity luncheon. A casting director sent a polite email explaining that a role had been reimagined. Hinted at Dean being difficult, a word that carried more weight than any insult, because it gave people permission to step away without guilt. Dean read the headlines once, then folded the paper and never opened it again. He had learned long ago that defending your reputation publicly often did more harm than letting your character speak privately, but the real blow came when the music stopped. A scheduled recording. Session months in planning was abruptly canceled. No explanation. No apology. Just a message from a manager who sounded tired, almost ashamed. "It's out of my hands," the man said. "They don't want to complicate things." Dean sat alone in his living room after the call ended, the late afternoon light stretching across the floor like a slow-moving shadow. Complicate things. That was what loyalty had become. An inconvenience, a risk, a complication. He could feel the weight of the choice he'd made pressing against him now, not as regret, but as reality. Integrity didn't protect you from consequences. It only made them easier to carry. That night, Dean walked instead of driving. He moved through streets that didn't recognize him, past diners and storefronts where people argued about small things and laughed about nothing at all. He liked those places. They reminded him that the world didn't revolve around contracts or cameras. Somewhere between two blocks, his phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar. He answered anyway. The voice on the other end was cautious, measured, belonging to someone who knew how dangerous words could be. The caller didn't introduce himself right away. He asked Dean if he was alone, asked if he was sitting down, then finally said, "What you refused today, others have accepted for years." Dean stopped walking. The man explained that the condition Dean had rejected wasn't new. It was part of a pattern unspoken, unofficial, but widely understood. Careers had been shaped by it. Some lifted higher than they deserved. Others quietly erased. The man wasn't calling to threaten him. He was calling to warn him. "You embarrassed people who don't like being exposed," he said. "They won't forgive it easily." Dean thanked him for the honesty and ended the call. He stood there for a long moment, traffic humming past, neon lights flickering on as the city prepared for night. Fear tried to find him then, creeping in through logic rather than emotion. What if this was the moment he miscalculated? What if standing still meant being buried? He exhaled slowly and kept walking. The next day brought a meeting he hadn't expected. A small foundation, quietly funded, invited him to speak. Not perform, not endorse, just talk. The venue was modest. No press, no spectacle. Dean almost declined. Then he remembered the young singer from the club, her surprised smile when she realized someone important was truly listening. He accepted. The room was filled with people. The industry rarely noticed musicians past their prime. Writers who had never broken through, performers whose careers had stalled for reasons no one ever explained out loud. Dean didn't give a speech. He told a story instead. Not about success, but about moments when he'd been tempted to trade himself for comfort. About the nights he'd gone home uneasy, even after winning. About how money could insulate you from hunger, but not from shame. When he finished, no one applauded right away. Then one person stood. Then another. Soon, the room was filled with quiet clapping, not loud, not performative, but heavy with understanding. Afterward, people came up to him not asking for favors. Not asking for roles, but thanking him for saying no when it mattered. Word of that meeting spread faster than any headline. Within days, something unexpected happened. A director young, independent, unafraid of burning bridges because he hadn't built many yet reached out. He wasn't offering millions. He was offering a script, raw, honest. A story about a man who refused to betray his values and paid for it. Only to discover that the cost revealed who was worth keeping. Dean read the script in one sitting. For the first time since the boardroom, he laughed not because it was funny, but because it was true. The studio executives heard about the project soon after. They scoffed publicly, dismissed it privately, and underestimated it entirely. What they didn't understand was that power weakened the moment it became predictable. And Dean Martin, the man they thought they had cornered, had become something far more dangerous than compliant. He had become untouchable. By the end of the week, the phone began ringing again, not with apologies, but with curiosity. People wanted to know if the rumors were true. If he really walked away, if he really refused. Dean answered honestly every time. Yes, he said. I did. And in those two words, the industry felt a shift it couldn't yet name only sense. Like a crack forming beneath polished floors, the million-dollar deal was gone. But something far greater was taking its place. The backlash no longer whispered. It moved openly now, wearing the disguise of professionalism, but carrying the weight of intent. Dean felt at the moment he stepped into the studio lot that morning, the way conversations stalled mid-sentence. The way smiles froze and then faded as he passed. He had walked through places like this for most of his life, but never like this. This wasn't indifference. This was coordination. The kind that required meetings behind closed doors and decisions made without names attached. The independent film had been announced quietly, but quietly was no longer possible. Someone had leaked the script's premise, stripping it of nuance and dressing it in accusation. Headlines began to appear, not loud enough to spark outrage, but sharp enough to wound. Phrases like grandstanding, attention-seeking, and out of touch floated through commentary panels and opinion columns. No one accused Dean of lying. They didn't need to. They framed him as emotional, idealistic, impractical. In this industry, that was how you discredited a man without ever challenging his truth. Dean didn't respond. He learned early that outrage fed the very systems it claimed to resist. Instead, he focused on the work. On the script, on the small cast and crew who believed in the project despite knowing what it might cost them. Rehearsals were held in borrowed spaces, sometimes changing locations at the last minute when permissions were suddenly revoked. Once, they arrived to find the doors locked with no explanation. Another time, equipment rentals vanished overnight, reclaimed by companies that suddenly claimed scheduling conflicts. Someone wanted the project to die quietly. But pressure has a way of clarifying resolve. One evening, after a particularly long rehearsal, Dean stayed behind alone in the empty room. The lights hummed softly above him as he reread a scene where his character was a stallmost. Kindly to betray someone he loved in exchange for comfort. The words felt uncomfortably close to home. He closed the script and leaned back, exhaustion pressing into his bones. For the first time since saying no, doubt crept in, not about his choice, but about how much more it would demand. That was when his phone rang again. This time, the voice didn't bother with courtesy. "You're making a mistake," the man said flatly. "You don't understand how deep this goes." Dean listened, his expression calm. He had learned that calm, unnerved people who relied on intimidation. The caller explained that sponsors were being contacted, that partnerships would disappear. Friends would be forced to choose between him and their livelihoods. "This doesn't end with you," the man warned. "It spreads." Dean's reply came slowly, carefully chosen. "Then it's already been spreading," he said. "I just stopped pretending not to see it." The line went dead. The next morning confirmed everything. A major venue withdrew its commitment to host the film's premiere. Another followed hours later. By afternoon, rumors circulated that the project would be shelved for everyone's benefit. Dean watched the news silently from his kitchen, coffee growing cold in his hands. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about erasure, about teaching a lesson, about reminding everyone watching what happened when you refused the condition. Then something unexpected happened. A letter arrived, not an email, not a call, but a letter, handwritten, from a woman Dean hadn't spoken to in years. A performer whose career had ended abruptly after she refused a similar request decades earlier. She wrote about watching him walk away from the deal, about how it felt like someone had finally said out loud what she had carried in silence for most of her life. She didn't ask him to stop. She thanked him for continuing. That letter didn't stay private. Others followed. Actors, musicians, writers, crew members. Some anonymous, some brave enough to sign their names. Each message carried the same quiet truth: you are not alone, even if it feels like it. The industry noticed. A live panel discussion scheduled months earlier, unrelated to Dean's situation, suddenly invited him as a guest. It was supposed to be safe, neutral, a controlled environment. Dean hesitated before accepting. He knew what this was. A test. A chance for them to watch him falter in public, to provoke him into saying something they could twist. He accepted anyway. The auditorium was packed. Cameras lined the walls. The moderator smiled too often. Questions began gently about legacy, about longevity, about adapting to change. Then the turn came. A carefully worded question about professional flexibility, about compromise, about whether standing your ground was always worth the collateral damage. The room leaned in. Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He didn't name names. He spoke about choices, about moments when success asks for silence and silence asks for pieces of your soul, about how power grows when people believe they are isolated, and about how dangerous it becomes when someone proves they're not. The applause wasn't immediate. Then it came slow. It was uncertain at first, then building into something undeniable. The broadcast cut to commercial earlier than planned. By the time Dean left the stage, his phone was vibrating nonstop. Messages from people he hadn't heard from in years. Offers that didn't include conditions. Invitations that felt different. Not transactional, but intentional. The independent film received an unexpected offer from an international festival known for celebrating difficult truths. The premiere was back on. The people who had tried to silence him realized too late that pressure had done the opposite of what they intended. They had made him visible. Dean returned home that night, physically exhausted but mentally clear. He stood by the window, watching the city lights pulse like a living thing. He knew the fight wasn't over. Systems didn't collapse because of one refusal, but cracks had formed. And cracks, once seen, could not be unseen. Somewhere in the city, deals were being rewritten, conditions reconsidered, silence no longer guaranteed. Dean smiled, not with triumph, But with calm certainty, the $1 million deal had been designed to own him. Instead, it had freed him. And the final confrontation, the one no one could control, was still coming. The morning of the premiere arrived without ceremony. No motorcades. No flashing lights. No desperate phone calls offering last-minute reconciliation. Dean woke early, long before the sun had decided what kind of day it would be. The quiet in his house felt different. Not heavy, not lonely, but resolved. He brewed his coffee slowly, standing by the kitchen counter as steam rose into the stillness. For the first time in weeks, there was nothing waiting to ambush him. No new rumor to counter. No bridge left to burn. Everything that could be taken had already been offered up willingly. That was the strange thing about surrendering leverage. Once you gave up the need to protect your position, fear lost its grip. The film festival venue sat on the edge of the city, modest compared to the towers that had once hosted his negotiations. But the energy outside was undeniable. People gathered: early critics, students, artists, workers from behind the scenes who rarely felt invited to moments like this. Dean arrived quietly, no entourage, no statement prepared. As he stepped inside, he felt the eyes on him, not with judgment, not with expectation, but with recognition. These were people who understood what it meant to be asked for something that didn't belong to the job description. Inside the theater, the atmosphere shifted. The lights dimmed. The murmurs faded. And as the screen came to life, Dean felt something unexpected: distance. The story unfolding was his, but also not his. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told that success required silence. Everyone who had been offered comfort in exchange for complicity. The film didn't accuse. It didn't shout. It simply told the truth, slowly, patiently, without asking permission. When the final scene ended, the theater didn't erupt. There was no instant applause. Instead, a silence filled the room, so complete it felt sacred. Then, one person stood. Then another. The applause rose not thunderous, but unwavering. The kind that didn't seek approval. The kind that acknowledged something had shifted. Backstage, Dean sat alone, hands resting on his knees. As a young assistant approached him with a trembling smile. "They're asking if you'll speak," she said. Dean nodded. He stepped back onto the stage. The light's warmer now, the faces clearer. He didn't hold a microphone right away. He let the moment breathe. Then he spoke, not as a performer, not as a symbol, but as a man who had reached the end of a long road and found himself still standing. "I was once told that saying no would cost me everything," he said calmly. "What no one mentioned was that saying yes would have cost me more." He didn't name the deal. He didn't describe the condition. He didn't need to. The room understood. He spoke about dignity not as an abstract virtue, but as a daily practice. About how systems survive not because they are powerful, but because people believe they are alone inside them. And about how fear loses its authority the moment it is shared. Outside that room, industry was already reacting. Articles began to appear, not attacking him this time, but examining what he had exposed. Former insiders spoke carefully, then more openly. Stories long buried surfaced, not identical, but unmistakably familiar. The narrative shifted, not overnight, but undeniably. Questions were asked that could not be unasked. Conditions were reconsidered. Quiet clauses disappeared from contracts, not because of outrage, but because exposure had made them toxic. A week later, Dean received an invitation. Not from a studio. Not from a boardroom. From a group of artists forming something new. They weren't offering money. They weren't offering protection. They were offering alignment. A space where no one had to pretend not to see what they saw. Where success didn't require erasure. Dean accepted. Months passed. The noise faded. Careers adjusted. Some people who had once avoided him now greeted him warmly, as though nothing had happened. Dean didn't correct them. He had no interest in revenge. The true consequence had already arrived, not in punishment, but in clarity. People knew where he stood, and more importantly, they knew where they stood with him. One evening, Long after the headlines had moved on, Dean returned to the small club where he'd once applauded a nervous young singer. She was there again, stronger now, sure. After her set, she approached him with a smile full of gratitude and courage. "I almost quit," she admitted. "Then I saw what you did." Dean shook his head gently. "You saw what you could do," he said, as he left the club that night. The city felt quieter, not because it had changed, but because he had. He had outlived the deal, outgrown the condition, and in doing so, left behind a map for others who might one day stand at a table, staring at a contract that asked for too much. The $1 million never came back, but something far more valuable did. Peace. And in the end, that was the one thing no condition could ever buy.